Hello, today I'm starting round 2 of rereading a favorite book. This time it is going to be Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. This is the edition that I have. It is a Barnes & Noble edition. So I wanted to show you what it looks like. It is so gorgeous. Neverland map. I love it. I'm so excited. I think I've read it twice before, but it's been almost 10 years since the last time I read it, so I'm very interested to reread it now. And like I love the feel of this book, of this story. I find it so whimsical and magical to read. And I mean, I've always loved this story because as I'm 34, and as long as I can remember, Peter Pan has been my favorite Disney movie. So there's that as well. So like I love this story. So I'm interested to see what reading it now is like. I'm also going to try and keep my thoughts pretty concise because so the first time I did this, like rereading a favorite book for making a video of it, was Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. That became a very long video, so I'm going to do my best to keep it concise, but we shall see. So a good first example of something that is whimsical and childlike about this book is that the dog is the nanny. Because of course, why not? Because why not? Why couldn't the dog be the nanny? The way that J.M. Barrie first describes the Neverlands as Mrs. Darling is like, you know, sorting out her children's minds as they go to sleep. And it's just perfect. It's perfect, and I love it. And it's the imagination that children have. I love it so much. And I think that's because it speaks to the similarities and like the universality of childhood, and like what a Neverland looks like is going to have cultural differences, but that there are things that children have because they are children that the Neverland represents that I love so much. So one thing that I think I want to pay attention to in this reread is mentions of death, because I'm on page 9 and there's already been 2, and I think that's very interesting with the story of Peter Pan. But so like the 2 references, let me see what they were. So the first reference of death is when Wendy is first talking to Mrs. Darling about Peter. And so Mrs. Darling, you know, is kind of thinking to herself, like sort of remembering from her own childhood, and recalls something about Peter. And so she thinks it says there were odd stories about him, is that when children died, he went part of the way with them so that they should not be frightened. Okay. The second reference then is on the next page. So she's talking about how like children sort of like come up with stories. Children have the strangest adventures without being troubled by them. For instance, they may remember to mention a week after the event happened that when they were in the wood, they met their dead father and had a game with him. So that first mention is sort of like in reference to basically like where the Lost Boys come from, like who they are, how they got there, which I think is such an interesting part of this story of Peter Pan. And then the second one being like on how children can just have, like, they have entire imaginings that are not odd to them. And so it gets to the part where like Mrs. Darling has found some leaves inside the children's bedroom. Like how, like she asks like, how did they get here? And she's like, oh, Peter must have been here. And she's like, excuse me? And so it reminds me of, stories I've heard, and of like parents having, like, almost every parent will have at least one story of something that their child said to them that was like, excuse me, what? Like, what did you see? What happened? Um, oh, that this is really reminding me of, which, also link with death. So I've just gotten to the first conversation between Peter and Wendy, and it's really reminding me of the first conversation between Ron and Hermione, because he's like trying to figure out how to put his shadow back on, and Wendy has such Hermione vibes with like, you have dirt on your nose, did you know? It's funny. So they've now basically arrived in Neverland. They're flying like above the island, taking a look around at everything, and the pirates have just shot a cannon at them, so they sort of get separated in the hullabaloo. And Tinkerbell is now sort of leading Wendy away because she doesn't like Wendy, and like it's been said a million times in analysis of Peter Pan. But how they're setting up the jealousy, like the female jealousy of Tinkerbell between like Peter and Wendy, and it's just doesn't need to be that way, because one, Wendy is a literal child. Two, Peter is a child. Three, Tinkerbell is a fairy. This doesn't need to happen, and yet it's so clearly set up that way, and it's sort of in the writing, it's sort of like tries to make it not be obvious, but like clearly it's obvious. And I'll explain what I mean by in the writing, because I'll read a short paragraph. But also, go into this thinking, would this happen if Tinkerbell was a male fairy? Or even if Tinkerbell was a male fairy and Peter was a female character? Keep that in mind. So, the short paragraph. Tink was not all bad, or rather, she was all bad just now, but on the other hand, sometimes she was all good. Fairies have to be one thing or the other, because being so small, they unfortunately have room for only one feeling at a time. They are, however, allowed to change, only it must be a complete change. At present, she was full of jealousy of Wendy. So you see there, it's sort of set up as, it's not because she's a lady, it's because she's a fairy and she can't help it. Like, please. And so with Tinkerbell also being almost... Okay. So I was thinking like of the representation of female characters who are like native to Neverland. You have Tinkerbell, you have Tiger Lily, and then you have the mermaids. Now I don't remember how Tiger Lily reacts to Wendy, but the mermaids are obviously... like, they try and drown her. So, lots of gender to discuss here. Although, now that I say that, I don't remember if they try and drown her just in the Disney version, or if they also do that in the book, so I guess we'll find out. It is necessary to point out, now that we're in Neverland, that the native tribe that live on the island are referred to with slurs. And I also think it's interesting, and let me know if you know anything about this, but that for a book, for like the human character, the children, they are from England. And yet it seems, and I might be wrong, so do correct me if I am, that the tribe on the island seem to be based on Native Americans. Now, that may be due to my limited knowledge of other indigenous nations, but I mean, I assume it's just colonialism. So we're now seeing the pirates for the first time, and are they black? Are some of them black? Because there's at least two of them are described as being black, including Captain Hook, who is described as the blackest and largest jewel in that dark setting. He's also described as having curly hair, which may or may not be a wig, but he's also described as having blue eyes. And I know that sometimes, especially with British writing, describing a character as black or dark does not mean they are actually black, but I mean, I've never seen an interpretation of Peter Pan where they are. That doesn't mean that's not what this means, though. So we're now seeing the native tribe for the first time, getting some details about them. It does list a name of a tribe that they are supposed to be, but it's not an actual nation of people. It is a word that, at least now, is a clearly anti-black derogatory term. Not the one you're thinking of, but they're not described as black. That doesn't take away from that. There is something encouraging, I suppose, about Tiger Lily, who is the princess. And so it's talking about how all the other men want to marry her. So I'll read the line that I like of the paragraph surrounding it that I don't like. And I'm going to use the word man, which is not the word that is used in the sentence. That's what I'm going to say. There is not a man who would not have the wayward thing to wife, but she staves off the altar with a hatchet. And I'm like, whatever you have to do, girl. It's not clear how old she is, either. Maybe they'll say that, but that's important. Also, another really quick, really obvious observation on gender is that when Wendy arrives on the island, the Lost Boys, although they have shot her out of the sky, still only view her as a girl, as fulfilling the function of a mother. So let's look a little bit deeper here. So I'm at the part where they've all found Wendy and they're trying to help her. And Peter says to the Lost Boys, we need a doctor. There's obviously not a doctor on Neverland, and so one of the boys pretends to be a doctor. And so then it says, talking about Peter, the difference between him and the other boys at such a time was that they knew it was make-believe, while to him, make-believe and true were exactly the same thing. Interesting. So it makes me think of like Neverland as a whole, because at the beginning of the previous chapter, it starts with feeling that Peter was on his way back, the Neverland had again woken to life. And then it says the next paragraph, in his absence, things are usually quiet on the island. So not that it doesn't exist without him, but there's a difference. And especially since we know from the beginning of the book that each child has their own version of Neverland, and whether that's like a separate island or just different versions of this island, it exists for all children. But this one, it seems to exist for Peter, that this is Peter's Neverland. I mean, and he's clearly like in charge of the island, and not quite in the sense that he controls it, but just that it sort of exists for his pleasure and curiosity. And that would also seem to explain why whatever he believes things to be is how they are. Whereas like the other, like even for the Lost Boys who live in Neverland with Peter, for them it's still make-believe. But for Peter it's real. I mean, that could mean a lot of things. Which also, interestingly, like, even it does become real for everyone else. Because, like, even if the entire thing is what Peter is making up, because it is real for him, it becomes real for everyone. Like, everyone is experiencing the pirates and the natives and the crocodile with the clock in its stomach. And viewing the story as a whole, as sort of commenting on children's imagination and how they play, you know, what they imagine themselves to be doing is what they're doing. It's real for them. Not in the sense that, like, like the way that a dream is real. You are experiencing it as you are visualizing it. I think it's really cool to capture that imagination in a story. I'd like to add to some of my previous thoughts on how Peter and the Lost Boys view Wendy as a mother. Because while that is, well, it can definitely be viewed as limiting and seeing her as a typical gender role, even as a young child. It is something that they value, and it is something that they see importance in, and something that they want and need. They want her to care for them. They value what that can provide to them. So I guess what I want to add is that while it may be limiting, that doesn't mean that it's not of value. And another thing about Wendy as well, speaking of balance and roles. So, like, it's talking about how, like, she's kept pretty busy, like, cooking them food and mending their clothes. But she also has a pet wolf. So, I mean, I'm not saying she's doing it wrong. Alright, so I'm going to read another few sentences, and this is another example of, like, the line between reality and make-believe and how that sort of revolves around Peter, and then on how that is, like, an example of how children play and their imagination. So, he often went out alone, and when he came back, you were never absolutely certain whether he had had an adventure or not. He might have forgotten it so completely that he said nothing about it, and then when you went out, you found the body. And on the other hand, he might have said a great deal about it, and yet you could not find the body. So it's like asking, like, a 4-year-old, what did you do today? And it's either nothing or this incredibly elaborate tale. And, like, you know it's somewhere in the middle, but, like, it'll either be, like, meaningless to them or the most intense thing that's ever happened to them. We have another example of valuing Wendy as a mother. So they're at the lagoon, and Hook is talking to 2 of the other pirates, and he seems very depressed. So they're like, what's going on, sir? And he says, the game's up, he cried. Those boys have found a mother. Like, he's like, why don't we just give up? They have a mother now to protect them. What could we possibly do to them? Like, I did not remember this part. It's like, that what she offers them just by caring for them is so powerful that, like, the villain of the story feels like he can't touch them. So I'm at the part in the lagoon where Hook and Peter are fighting, and they're in the water, and they're both climbing out of the water onto the same large rock. So they're climbing up from different directions, and so, like, they meet at the top, and they start fighting, but like, Peter grabs Hook's dagger and is going to stab him, but notices that he is higher up than Hook is, giving him an advantage. So he's like, well, that's not fair. So he goes to pull Hook up so that they're on an even playing field for their fight. And Hook bites Peter. And now I'm going to read what it says next. Not the pain of this, but its unfairness was what dazed Peter. It made him quite helpless. He could only stare, horrified. Every child is thus affected the first time he is treated unfairly. All he thinks he has a right to when he comes to you to be yours is fairness. After you have been unfair to him, he will love you again, but he will never afterwards be quite the same boy. No one ever gets over the first unfairness. No one except Peter. He often met it, but he always forgot it. I suppose that was the real difference between him and all the rest. So I think that this has to be about more than just that Peter's constantly forgetting things. And that is, I mean, young children, memory for them is so much different than it is for an older child or an adult. But memory is used for learning. So if Peter can never remember anything, how can he ever learn anything? But does he, or does he need to? And how does his ability to have what he imagines become real affect that need for learning? And I'm not really sure what that means yet, or what I think about it yet. But I think also because we have Wendy and John and Michael starting to forget their parents and their life outside of Neverland. Yeah, I haven't fully made those connections yet, but I will be thinking about that as I continue. Update from before, I was correct. The mermaids do try to drown Wendy. So Peter has saved Tiger Lily's life, which the rest of her tribe are very appreciative of. But the way that their appreciation is written is a real problem. The way that their speech pattern is written is clearly racist. It's incredibly simplified English like a toddler would speak, and the level of deference that they're showing him is such that even the Lost Boys are like, this is a bit much. And even Wendy can see that this is a problem, but it says, quote, but she was far too loyal a housewife to listen to any complaints against him. Excuse me? So Wendy is telling the Lost Boys a story, and really it's their story. And so she's like, how sad Mr. and Mrs. Darling must be that their 3 children are gone, but she's expecting that, you know, they're keeping the window open for them whenever they might feel like returning. And how they'll stay away as long as they want to, have as much fun as they want, and then, you know, years from now they can just, you know, wander back home and will be welcomed with open arms. And then so Peter shares, and whether it is true or not, it is something Peter believes, that he once tried to fly home, but found that his window was closed to him and that there was a new little boy sleeping in his bed. So he tells her basically, don't expect to be able to go back home, basically. And so that story kind of scares them. So Wendy decides, okay, it's time to go home. So like she gets John and Michael together, and the Lost Boys don't like this. They want them to stay. But then, to his credit, it says, then Peter returned, and they saw at once that they would get no support from him. He would keep no girl in the Neverland against her will. So, at least you can say that for him. This is such a complicated book. And honestly, I don't know if it's like, oh, it's so complex, or if it's just a little messy. But, so they're on the pirate ship now. And Hook thinks he has killed Peter. He's got all the rest of the kids tied up below decks. And he's walking around thinking, like, this should be my, like, shining best, like, my highest achievement. He's like, I should feel as successful as I've ever felt. But he doesn't feel it. And then for, like, 4 pages, goes on to have, like, an identity crisis of, like, am I a good man? Am I a bad man? Am I good at being a bad guy? Like, culminating in the question, are there any children who love me? Like, sir, what is happening to you? And part of why this is all interesting is because so much of what happens in Neverland is as the children imagine it to be, but you're not going to have a group of kids imagining, oh, I bet Hook is up there having an identity crisis. It's just, like, there are these moments of, like, individual characterization that a lot of it, I think, is, like, because, like, the author is sometimes speaking directly to the reader, and I think that's where it comes from, but which I love. It's just, it's dynamic, I guess. So Hook is having this crisis. He eventually gets to the point where he's like, I don't want to think about this. Let's just kill some kids. So he has the other pirates bring up the boys. He leaves Wendy down below decks and says to them, 2 of you can join my crew as pirates. The rest of you I'm going to kill. Which 2 of you do you want it to be? They end up refusing, so he brings up Wendy then. And so then in this part with Wendy, there is again this very complicated mix of characterization for her, because she's described as what she doesn't like about the pirate ship and the pirates. She's like, yeah, the boys are kind of tempted a little bit to join the ship, but she is certainly not, because it is a mess around here. Like, it has not been scrubbed in years. And I'm like, that's what she notices? But then there's this line. There was not a porthole on the grimy glass of which you might not have written with your finger, dirty pig, and she had already written it on several. And I'm like, yes. Yes. She's just down there, tied up with all the other boys, facing likely imminent death, and she's just writing on the windows, dirty pig. Dirty pig. I'm also really noticing this time, and I'm sure I've mentioned it previously, but the, like, pretty intense British nationalism that's going on here. And, like, for the time, like, I get it. I just don't like it now. So we're on the pirate ship. They've brought up Wendy. And I don't know why Hook is going along with the idea that she is their mother, but setting that aside for the moment. So he says, you know, boys, your mother is about to speak her very last words to you before you all die. So she says to them, I feel that I have a message to you from your real mothers, and it is this. And I'm like, oh goodness, like I kind of have chills, like what is she going to say? And then she says, we hope our sons will die like English gentlemen. And I'm like, so I just finished the book, and the last 3 chapters are so beautifully written, and it's why I love this book so much, even though there's so much that is frustrating and that I don't particularly like. There's a lot that I like so much, and that's why it's one of my favorites. So it's so worth reading. It's has such a magical feel to it that I love this story. I love this story so much.